showing projected sea level rise. There were 5 teams in this case that were asked to look at various parts of the New York Harbor. And my team was looking at, we're team 0, and we were, it was DLAND partnered with Architecture Research Office. So it was for an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. And it was the first time that work had actually been commissioned for, or design work had been commissioned specifically for an exhibition at the museum. So we were looking at Lower Manhattan, and I thought I tend to always use a research process where I look at the history of a place, and I look at the history of a place beyond its kind of cultural history. I tend to focus a lot also on its geologic history or its natural history. But it's interesting to look at the sort of edge of Manhattan over time. And you can see in 1650, that shoreline was much smaller, or was much, it was a much smaller island. And over time, we've built that out. And you can see from the images on the bottom, the reason for that construction, or the reason for that fill, was to facilitate shipping and commerce. So industry kind of drove this transformation, and also a change in technology drove that transformation from, the boats, these large 3-masted schooners, to boats that could pull up alongside of a bulkhead, to these large kind of piers for much larger kinds of vessels. So, but by 1960, we had this landscape of these finger piers stretching out into the water, but that technology became kind of obsolescent with the creation of highways. And so that waterfront became something else. And so by 2010, when we did this work, the highest and best use of that waterfront space became recreation and residential. So this was an image that I'd done as part of a planning project for the city, trying to have a vision for the overall connectivity. So it's useful to look back in time at historic maps. And this is a very important one created by Egbert Biele. And it's a sanitary and topographic map of New York City from 1845. And what I want you to take away from this map is the relationship between that and that image that you saw before of the 1645 waterline. You can see that that image kind of mimics this lighter green area. And I think the other thing I want you to focus on is that this darker green area cutting through the city is a wetland, and that there were ponds. So there's a hydrology that existed in 1845 that we see wants to come back. And I'll explain that in a minute. So here you can see in this diagram, our 2100 value at risk. So by the year 2100, this is the potential sea level rise that could happen, and also the potential flooding that would come from an 18-foot Category 2 storm surge. And again, looking back at the Biele map, you can see the relationship between that old shoreline and this new area that gets flooded. All of the land that we've built out is the area that's most vulnerable. So we examined and diagrammed the existing seawall. We looked at that in relation to sea level rise by 2100, and then this Category 2 storm inundation. So it was important to do this kind of reductive mapping. And then we also looked at the combined sewer overflows. New York City has a combined sewer system where if we get too much rain in any particular area, the storm drains will overflow and the sanitary sewage will combine with the storm sewage and overflow into our waterways. And there are actually hundreds of cities across the United States that have this condition. And so the Environmental Protection Agency has put forth consent decrees against a lot of cities to clean up this situation. And New York has one of these consent decrees. So it's a very important problem. But our notion was that we had fresh water coming down, which was affecting the combined sewer overflows. And we had this potential flooding coming from the waterfront. And so the concept was water in and water out. And the area in which we were working, we called this new urban ground. So everything that was constructed after 1625 became this new urban ground. Within that zone, we had level 1 streets for absorption. And you can see what this might look like. We transformed the way the streets were engineered to make the streets permeable, and then to put all of the utilities into waterproof vaults underneath the sidewalks. They would have hatches so that you could access them when the technology became obsolescent. But what this did was actually open up 26% of the landscape to become permeable and more absorbent. We had level 2 streets for distribution and collection. So these would hold more water and become conduits for that freshwater flow. And then these level 3 streets for protection. So if you had a large storm event, these streets would hold that water until the tides went out and until the water could be drained. So this whole system became a porous green street system. We had a new 6-foot hardened edge. So we recognized that we needed to elevate the edge of the shoreline. And then we had new waterfront parks. So these would be managing some of that freshwater. And then freshwater wetlands, also managing the freshwater. These are similar to my sponge park project in Gowanus. And then we had a series of salt marshes that would provide some kind of protection from large storm surges to create an overall resilient system. And you can see, I'm going to go quickly around the island to show you what this would look like. But we had this Hudson River estuary. So this is over where Battery Park City is now. And in the area where Battery Park City is, the construction of new land has already gone out to an area where the currents of the Hudson River are very fast. So it's gone out to that shelf, and you can see the density of the white lines. That shows the bathymetry is quite steep there. So what we did was we cut into the city. We sacrificed some of Battery Park City in order to make a new pattern of urbanism. And this crenellated design for the west side had alternating patterns of urban design of new buildings and these landscapes that would be these protective landscapes, which also coincidentally, or not coincidentally by design, had programming included. So we had boat slips and walkways and recreational space weaving into the city. And then along the Battery, so down along where the old fortifications exist at the end of Manhattan, we created this series of barrier islands that would help to protect the city from storm surge and also create a new kind of level of ecological productivity. This was, I would say, probably inspiration for the Living Shorelines project that is being built off of Staten Island, and included landscapes that would grow in strength over time. Our thinking was that if you create an engineered system, it's only as good as the first day that you make it. And if you create a natural system or a hybrid engineered and natural system, that it will grow in strength over time. It's kind of like kids. So then over on the east side, there we had a little bit more flexibility with the currents and found that there were shallows so that we could create an East River esker and breakwater. My reference to an esker is that it's a geologic formation that's this kind of snake-like topography or berm. So we elevated the landscape with that kind of landscape form, and then outbound of that had these breakwaters which would trap sediment and become these kind of naturally, they would grow in strength over time with the natural forces of the currents. And here you can see an image of what that might look like with a new way of experiencing the landscape with these walkways out over the wetland and these protected zones for canoeing and kayaking. We created these things called sponge slips. So in the space where there used to be an exchange of goods, the boats used to be able to pull up into these slip spaces. So here we're saying, okay, if we get a big flood, the water can come into these slip spaces and get absorbed. And so it would become a place of ecological exchange instead of commercial exchange. And all of this would come together and make a new resilient city. So this image, I think, has become kind of the poster child for what to do. And it's very much of an adaptive strategy. I think our theory was that the landscape or the real estate was so valuable in Lower Manhattan that it required an adaptation in place strategy. And what I'm going to show you next is our work for the 4th regional plan, which has a slightly different take on things. So again, you know, I use the term coastal urbanism, and I did this project in collaboration with Rafi Siegel, who is a professor at MIT and has a practice called Rafi Siegel AU. And he's very much of an urbanist and has been at MIT for a few years now. But we met when we were both professors at the Cooper Union, and we had done an extensive study on the suburb. And we actually wanted to be doing the suburban part of this this project, but they gave us the waterfront, and I'm really glad that they did. I kind of felt at the time that I had done enough with the waterfront because of MoMA and the Sponge Park, but we actually developed a lot of new material that's been very important to my thinking. So the Regional Plan Association is an organization that has prepared long-range plans for the tri-state metropolis since 1922. So their original plans, or some of their original work, had these beautiful images that included these paintings. This is the painting is this overview of the city, and then this image over to the right is Hugh Ferris, the vision of the future city. So you can see that they had this incredible visual power. Some of the subsequent plans did not have that visual power, particularly recently, and they became these planning documents that had gotten quite dry and weren't really capturing the public's attention. So it's funny, again, Guy Nordenson and Catherine Sievett approached the Rockefeller Foundation and the RPA and suggested that they have a competition and invite designers to come up with visions for the future of the city based on the parameters of the RPA's work. So traditionally, the RPA, or when they were first doing their early plans, this is showing a plan from 1929, you can see that they showed a concentric kind of system with a center and spoke diagram with radial transportation corridors. The more recent plan showed a different kind of scheme. So with our coastal urbanism project, we won this competition, and our group Rafi and I led a group, and Rafi recruited a number of very intelligent, talented people from MIT, including Sarah Williams, who has this incredible technical GIS knowledge, Greg Lindsay, who's a tremendous urban thinker and writer, Brent Ryan, who had done a lot of work on housing and FEMA retrofits of building after Hurricane Sandy, and then Benjamin Albrecht, who was kind of Rafi's right-hand man and a Fulbright scholar from Germany. And then we had additional student support, graduate student support. So the corridors that I was referring to before, so they had started with this radial system, and then they moved to something different, and it was a system of dividing the area based on ecoregion instead of a transportation system. So the sensitivity to the environment was really interesting as a big shift. So we had, in our case, the four areas that we were competing to design were the Highlands, the Inner Ring, the Triborough, and the Bight. Now the Triborough is a bit of a vestigial element from the old way of thinking, because that is actually a transportation corridor, but the other systems are all this kind of interconnected landscape that goes from mountains to shore. So in looking at the shore, we started by analyzing sort of what it was and how it has transformed. So you saw a bit of this work, or you saw these ideas introduced in our Rising Currents project, but we diagrammed kind of the shape of that in section, and also the relationship between people and nature and water and land, and the sort of the nature of the edge, you know, suggesting tidal fluctuation, that there's a broadness to that and a softness of that edge condition. And if we look back at the mapping of the broader area, you can see a network of historic streams and existing tidal wetlands and historic wetlands that existed all along this shoreline of the Atlantic Ocean. And one thing to keep in mind, which is very important, is that this is Long Island, and you know, this big island, and Manhattan is over here. Hopefully you can see my mouse. And that this barrier island that exists all along the edge of Long Island is actually kind of a series of islands, and that it used to be a very dynamic condition, but that with human development, we have hardened that edge, or we've had an expectation that it would remain static. And that is part of what's causing all of these problems, because we have a landscape that wants to move, and we have houses that we really don't want to have move. So the hardening that I mentioned in relation to that barrier island can be seen in a much more intensive way in this drawing, this section drawing of kind of a typical waterfront edge in New York, where you have a bulkhead and a pier situation, so that the water and the land interchange has become much tighter and much more of a line. So as transportation systems evolved and our shipping systems changed, the nature of exchange between water and land has changed. And so there's a migration of that exchange inward. And what that means is that this line is really in question. And that line is in question because of the different, or the changing use, but also because of the pressures of climate change. And here you can see an example of what that pressure can do. So by 2050, more than 2 million people and 1 million jobs will be at risk of flooding. So will power plants, oil refineries, wastewater treatment plants, rail lines, and much more. And we saw that with Hurricane Sandy, that those impacts were tremendous financially, losing almost $20 billion, and also tremendous in terms of human loss, with 50 deaths associated with Sandy. It seems a little bit, I hate to say it, but light in relation to the COVID crisis that we're having, but this is something that we need to address. So one of the wonderful things about working with, I'll say Sarah Williams from MIT, was that she had done a lot of work on the Rebuild by Design project and had this extensive database of information about infrastructure and flooding. So she had these GIS layers. And so we sat down, and one of the advantages of being a practitioner, in addition to being an academic, is that I kind of knew the right layers to put together and knew the right questions to ask in order to create an output that was more meaningful. So the main point here with this drawing is that infrastructure works when it's connected, but when you get disconnections like this, you end up with a fragmented system. And this fragmented system is not viable. People can't get from one place to another. And you can see how vulnerable that infrastructure is in New York City. We also looked at mobility, beyond the roads that get people from one place to another. We were also looking at social mobility and socioeconomic status, and examining areas where people were living in housing projects or public housing and didn't have the ability to move if there was a big storm, or didn't have the ability to get out of the place that they were living in general and migrate to a different area. So this also had to do with people who were young, very young, or people who were very old. So we mapped this in relation to our study. So I showed you a couple of these critical issues for the larger zone of Jamaica Bay. So our study involved, all of what we call the bite, or sort of this elbow of landscape that is the waterfront edge of the region. And we developed schemes for larger scale work, which is what I'm going to share with you today at Jamaica Bay, but also suburban areas, Mastic Beach out in Long Island, and then also the Seabright area, which is down in suburban New Jersey, which is a very small community. And we looked at opportunities for the development of new energy, recreation, conservation, and habitat strategies. So with energy, from a centralized petrol-based economy to a decentralized and renewable idea, with recreation space, from large-scale seasonal destinations for the masses to smaller scale everyday situations, with conservation, from passive preservation to active regeneration, and habitation to diversify the typologies for more heterogeneous population and household structures. So we were trying to incorporate these ideas into new programs for this waterfront area. So this is Jamaica Bay. So this was our large site. And you can see Manhattan here in the distance. The MoMA Rising Currents project is over here. And our idea was to receive, protect, and adapt. So by receiving, we mean that we want to strengthen the existing higher ground spines So develop those areas to receive people, protect, create landscape buffers. So use ecosystem services to our advantage, and then adapt by making a new kind of urbanism and a new kind of landscape. So our intention was to reshape the waterfront for the highest and best value. So that area in between where the exchange is happening and the waterfront edge could be transformed. And I show examples actually from other work, wasn't related directly to this project, but I used it for this. But I had developed these schemes for how to adapt waterfront edges for greater ecological productivity. So for a tourist economy, for a mercantile economy, for an industrial economy, for an agricultural economy. So looking at these different kinds of transformations, these physical forms for the reshaping of our edge. And then also drew upon some actual work that we were doing, like physical work that we were actually building in New York for wetland mitigation banking systems, where we were thinking about or utilizing an idea of capturing the natural power of a landscape edge in a constructed system. So this we characterized as the wet system for ecosystem services. So this was the furthest out in our spectrum. And then we had these semi-wet spaces. This is on the upper or in the middle top. That's our sponge park in the Gowanus Canal. Some work that we did just directly below that in Long Island after Sandy for rebuilding waterfront edges next to parkland. And then on the upper right, the Battery Breakwater that I showed you before, these kind of living landscapes out in the water. So these are the semi-wet versions that provide programming and also a filtering and a greater level of both protection and ecological productivity. And then we had these high ground spines. So these are areas where the landscape has actually been lifted, and there's an interchange between urbanity and the waterfront. So we're not saying, oh, we have to abandon the waterfront completely. We're saying, let's just retreat somewhat and elevate and sort of adapt to that kind of new program or that new condition. So again, going back to Sarah Williams' work, we discovered that there was this incredible kind of unrealized urban potential in transportation corridors that were constructed, they're train lines that were constructed, but never, the urbanity along those train lines never happened because in the United States we have cheap fuel and lots of highways. So it's easy for people to drive. So instead of having this wonderful kind of corridor of density and then a lot of open space, we have suburban sprawl. And that suburban sprawl is what is most vulnerable to these sea level rise impacts at this point, and what is exacerbating the problem with climate change. So in any case, we said, hey, well, this is a place where we have a good transportation system. Let's actually make that denser. So we're capitalizing on this unrealized urban potential. And then we also looked at the projected flooding in the Jamaica Bay area. So we have a place where people can go, and then we have a place that people are going to be moving away from. And you can see that, underneath all this blue, there's a lot of housing stock, and that needs to be changed. This is the property damage from flooding from Hurricane Sandy. And you can see that it's pretty tremendous. And here, this is the flooded housing. So I think there are 1 million people in our catchment zones, and 408,000 are projected to be underwater by 2050. So we have a total population in this zone of 1.2 million people that we suggested needed to move. And so our idea was to develop these higher ground spines, which you saw in that map before, and to get people away from the potential for this kind of situation where they're encountering this damage from flooding and potential, you know, harm of their health and even life. So we want to send, we want to have sending neighborhoods and receiving neighborhoods. So we're sending people away from the waterfront and receiving them on higher ground. So, and we use those terms very intentionally instead of the term retreat, because again, Americans don't like the term retreat or running away, even though it's the smartest thing to do. And even though, you know, sometimes even if you think about like military logistics, it's better to retreat so that you can then, you know, go back and fight another day. But in any case, so we use the term sending and receiving. We also thought very much about community. And so our strategy involved moving entire blocks of people to higher ground. So you'd move a whole neighborhood instead of just saying, hey, individual, why don't you move? We were suggesting that, you know, that we get more of a group think idea going and try to preserve some of the community that existed in those vulnerable zones in these new higher ground developments. So I showed that we had a million people in that 65.89 square mile area. And what we're proposing is a population of 1.2 million in a smaller area. So we're proposing increased density, but at the same time, we're proposing more public access to public space. So we're adding population, we're increasing density, and we're reducing risk. But our FAR is going, our floor area ratio is going from 0.86 to 1.66. So, and you can see the opportunities here with this new Bite City. So this orange space for mixed use residential use. And then we have this kind of larger area of new park space at the heart of our project. This gateway station, so a way to get to the airport by boat, and then also maintaining JFK Airport, which was a requirement of the Regional Plan Association. We were asked to not say that JFK was not viable, and then an industrial area around the airport. So presumably there will be investments made in the airport to make it continue to be viable, even though it's on low ground now. But so within the scheme, we had ways to connect all of these different systems with a really sort of great network of transportation and park spaces. And you can see the layers of public transportation, ferries, upland plants, and marshlands. So thinking about different typologies of landscapes as well to make this Jamaica Bay and Bite City vision a reality. So we created new, these new city edges on the upland, and we wanted to make them, even though they have a hardened edge, we wanted to make them ecologically productive. So we created these kind of hybrid situations to create this kind of water life where you have you're living with water and nature. And then also maintained the JFK Airport because it's such an important commercial generator for the city. But we wanted to increase the access of it with this one-stop ride to Kennedy by boat. And these water and gondola accesses to recreation and this gateway to Kennedy, as I showed you before. to create this new light city. And I think the main thing to think about is that it's an anticipatory urban design strategy. We're not being reactive, we're trying to be proactive about the future and think about, you know, a strong vision that is safer and greener and better for society. So thank you very much.